Hi there. In this video, I will show you, sorry, this is annoying. Everything that you need to know about the ACT and how you can prepare for it, whether you have 1 year to prepare for it, 1 month, 1 week, 1 day, whatever. And obviously there will be different things based on how much time you have. And so let's get on with it. What is the ACT? So if you don't know what it is, this is what it is. It's a test that most juniors take in high school. Sometimes you can take the ACT or the SAT instead. Sometimes you have to take both. Sometimes you only have to take one. And schools are starting to not require these, or like colleges, I mean, are not requiring these scores as much anymore. But as of now, you still need to do that. But unlike the SAT, it has a science section and it has different timing. Some say you might have a little bit more time on the SAT for some things. Also, you can use a calculator on the math test. There's not more than one math test like on the SAT. There's only one math test. And I'll talk about the different sections, what types of questions there are, strategies later in this video. Order of the test. So what things happen? So first, you will do an English test. And it is 75 questions in 45 minutes. So you might think, oh, wow, that's like no time. It does seem like that. But this is the test that has the most questions of all. But it's really not that most students don't have a hard time finishing it because questions are very quick to answer. And we'll look at what they're like. So on this test, you have to answer questions about grammar, sentence structure, wording, and more. Honestly, it's not really that hard. It's considered the easiest test by many because it's just like, oh, you know where punctuation goes, you know what word you would say in this case. Some can be a little bit harder, but there's a strategy I learned, and it is the most helpful strategy. So stay tuned to see what that is. It's very helpful. It's the most helpful thing. And it probably, if you didn't know that and then you figure it out, it can make you get like probably like 20 more questions right because like it applies to a lot of different ones. But the math section is next after that, immediately after. And it has 60 questions in 60 minutes. And that might seem like kind of a lot of time if, well, maybe not, but that you might think, oh, 1 minute per question. That's actually not what you want to do because as I'll talk about with the math strategies, the questions get harder towards the end. They're more easy at the beginning. There are a few like hard ones here and there, like, oh, maybe 29 was hard, 36. But then you'll notice, oh, 51, 52, 53, all the way to 60. Those might be hard. And you can use the calculator the whole time. And these are the things that it mostly tests you on. Algebra, geometry, trigonometry, simple word problems. And for some of you, unfortunately, you may have not learned some of the things. But if you took algebra and geometry, which includes trigonometry, then it should be, you just need to make sure that you know those things. Really, the only test on the whole ACT where you have to know a whole lot of background information is the math test. So if you don't know, if you're not good at math, you need to make sure you're reviewing these kinds of questions. There's lots of practice tests online. I'll try to put a link to some in the description thing. So that's the math test. And remember, I'll talk about strategies later. So then after the math section, you get a 15-minute break, but then you have the reading test. And you might say, hey, there was already English. Not the same thing. Unfortunately, not the same thing. And there's 40 questions in 35 minutes. And this one is probably, it's pretty hard. Like for some, the math can be the hardest, but for others that are good at math, this might be the hardest because you have to read very fast. And we'll talk about the strategies for that. But you'll have to read passages and answer questions about them. Like if you've taken a class like AP Lang or really any English class, it's just like those. It's you have a passage and then you have questions about that. And it'll ask like when line. We'll look at some example questions. I'm not trying to get into that yet. Just right now, I'm just telling you the parts of it. But one of them will be a story, and the others are nonfiction. So one might say like, oh, there was a person. They walked down the street. They I don't know, whatever. And then the other ones are like, oh, here's some science thing about like, I don't know, supernovas or something like, and then it will explain about it and just things like that. Or like one will talk about like a author and like explain things, just like that. Then you have the science section, which is the same amount of questions in the same amount of minutes, and it is also very hard to finish. But once again, talk about some strategies. And there are passages, and don't get like freaked out. They're not really like reading passages. They're more like just telling you about an experiment, and then there's graphs and tables showing the data from that experiment. And one of them will not have graphs, and it's called conflicting viewpoints. So we'll say, scientist 1 says to put a trash can on your head. Scientist 2 says, sit on a trash can. Scientist 3 says to put it on your head and then sit on it, like things like that. Like obviously that's not a real example, but and then it will ask questions like, if someone is walking with a trash can on their head, which scientist would support this? That's what it's like. Then you get a 5-minute break after that, and then some people that will be it for you, but others you might have to take the writing test if you signed up for it. And it's a good thing to do because that can be useful for sending to colleges. And you may not have to do this, but you have one essay to do in 40 minutes, and it's not that hard to finish because it's a very simple prompt. Like, for example, we'll see in a minute, like, why are extracurricular activities beneficial? Something like that, And then there's 3 perspectives, like perspective 1, they are beneficial, they're not, whatever. And then you use them to support your argument. And we'll talk about strategies once again. How's the ACT scored? You get a score from 1 to 36. Obviously 36 is the best that you can get. And so there's each section, 1, 2, 3, 4. The writing is separate. It doesn't go into your score. And you get a score based on these, and then you average them. So what is a good score is what a lot of people say. And it really depends on your goal. But in most cases, really all cases, you want to get at least a 21, which is not that difficult to do, honestly. This is not always the case, but anyone that gets below that, typically it's because they may have not really tried or just kind of gave up or maybe didn't finish the test, something like that. But even if you don't really know anything, you'll probably get a 21 at least. But low-level colleges, they want at least a 21, but maybe some middle level colleges, like a little bit more advanced, they might want like a 27. And then upper level colleges, they want a 34 or up, which is pretty difficult to get. And the higher the score, the more scholarships you get. So you may say, well, I took a practice test, I got a 21, I know I'm going to get into the college I want. Well, if you have more time, why don't you try to get a higher score? Because then you will get more scholarships and it'll save you money in the long run. That's good. So yeah, and by using these strategies, I'll tell you in a minute, that can improve your score. How do you prepare for the ACT? How? Well, first you need to know how much time do you have until your test? Do you know what day it is? Well, that's the first thing to know. But if you have 1 week or more, you're going to want to do some practice tests and review those practice tests. If you only have one night, don't do that. That is not a good idea because you will just be too tired, and it's not going to help you just to do a practice test if you're watching this the night before your test. What you need to do, look at the skips. I don't know why I wrote that, sorry. Look at the like the tips, not the skips. I don't know. That's weird. Why? I don't know why I said that. But that's later in this video. Look at the tips that I told you. The more time you have, the more spaced out your practice test can be. So if you have a week, then you may only want to do 1 or 2. But if you have a month, maybe try to do 3 or 4. If you have a year, then do maybe like two per month or something. And it is not, it's, I mean, if you really want, if you're trying to get like a 36, then it definitely is useful to start preparing a while in advance. But it's not always necessary to start that far in advance, but it can be useful. But if you are limited on time, you may not even really need to start preparing until a month or 2 before. And it's not the end of the world if you're watching this the night before, because many have still been successful just by, and if you look at these tips, and I guarantee that it should cause some improvement, because it definitely helped me. So what are some practice test techniques? Not for the actual tests, but I'm just saying, what do you do when you take the practice tests? You need to complete the test just like you would on exam day. So don't be like, well, you know, I'll just have no time limit. I'll just complete the questions in however amount of time, or I'll just do the math today and I'll do the reading tomorrow. Well, that's not really that helpful, because one of the main things that the ACT tests you on is not necessarily the content, but is your endurance. You need to know what it's like to take a test for hours. And as much as that seems annoying, it really will help you. Just set aside a few hours one evening every so often and just do it, because if you really care about getting a high score, then that's what you need to do. And I remember I did not like doing that, and there's definitely better things that I wanted to do, but it's just the most beneficial thing you can do to improve. And after you take the test, this is really important. Look at what you got on it. See if that's what score you like, or if you want to improve. See what you need to improve on, and go through every single question that you got wrong and determine why you got it wrong. And like, for example, on the math, you're like, oh, I got all these geometry ones wrong. Well, then that means that you need to review geometry. And by the way, if you didn't know, I have a whole course of videos for geometry. So just click on this channel and go to, it's actually on a separate YouTube channel, Jacob Nash Geometry Lessons. Same thing with algebra. I have algebra lessons, pre-calculus lessons. Well, yeah, actually, you might not have taken pre-calculus yet if you're taking the ACT, but yeah. So if you don't do this, then it was pointless. Like, you're just like, oh, well, you know, I messed up. Well, don't you want to improve? Like, you don't want to wait. You're wasting your time if you just keep taking tests, because you're probably not going to improve. You're going to do the same thing because you didn't learn anything new. What you really learn is from your mistakes. And yeah, like I said, if you struggle on a specific section, work on that. So that's when you may want to work on just a specific section. So, okay, I'm going to do a math test today, but you need to still know what it's like to do a full test a few times. Depending on how, like I said, depending on how long you have, you may want to do only 1 or 2 tests, full tests, or you might want to do multiple. So here's an example for, like, if you had 1 month left. Let's say the blue squares were what days you decided to do it. So today is Tuesday the 8th when I made this, and let's say your exam is on April 9th, a Saturday. You might say, okay, I'll do practice test on the 10th, then I'll do another one on the 15th, 23rd, 27th, 6th. That should be good. You don't want to do too many. Some people, like, they're like, all right, I'll do one every other day. No, that's just going to make you get burnt out. And plus, you probably have a lot on your plate as a junior anyways. You might have a job. You don't even have time for that. You don't do that. Just This might be even more than you need to do. It just depends. But let's say you did a test on the 11th or the 10th, then on the 11th, why don't you go through what you did wrong? And that's what you're going to want to do. Now let's look at the actual strategies for each section. I've just told you how to practice and I've told you about the test. Let's see, what do you actually do? What kind of questions will you have? Let's see. So what about the English section? The number one tip that you need to remember every time you take the test, and this, I am not kidding. I've seen so many videos, every single person says this, and it is definitely true. Less is better. So what does that mean? Any question that has more than one option that says the same thing, always choose the one that says the least. And there's not any contradiction to this. I've taken various practice tests and the actual test, and there has never been a contradiction to this. Every single time, the correct answer is the one that has the least. That is what you need to know. And that is very helpful because sometimes these questions can be the hardest because you're like, well, what sounds better? Does it need to be what gives more information? No, a lot of times these are just redundant. So we'll look at an example of how you would use this. Also, no commas are needed before non-conjunctions in some cases. Not in every case, but in some where you're like, do I need a comma here? You might not. Like, but you will need one if there's a phrase that can be omitted. But that's why you need to do a lot of practice tests, because you'll see the same questions over and over. My first English practice test, I got a 25 on. After I did a couple, I got a 34. And it really was from just looking at my mistakes. And the good thing about the English test is you don't really have to look up why the correct answer is that. You can just notice like, oh, I guess that means this is the right thing. And then do that next time. And then you'll get more right. Context is everything. That's another thing. You're like, if it's like, what should the author say next? And you don't know. Well, just look at what it says before, look at what it says after. What makes sense? It can't be something that's out of place. So what are example problems? So this is what the questions look like. There's always a little thing that's underlined with the question number, and it's what it's talking about. So now that he's nationally recognized as an artist of who? So should that stay the same? Should we change it to being whom or who? Now that he's nationally recognized artist who has, it's D. Can I draw on this thing? It's D. Like, I mean, that one to me is just easy because like, if you read it, it's like an artist who, an artist whom, that doesn't make sense, of whom, of being whom, whatever. So those are like one of the more easier ones. And you don't actually have to read everything. Just make sure you understand what it's talking about. So we could just skip down here a little bit. All right, Basket Makers Alliance, a group that works to help preserve it. He's on the board of the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance, a group that works to help preserve it. Well, you have to say preserve by, we know it's not the lead, that wouldn't make sense if there was nothing there. And we need to say this art because we don't know what it is talking about. Preserve this art, preserve it. What are you talking about? So, and that's not what I'm talking about with less is better. We'll look at this in an example. His other goal is to continue to stand out, to continue to distinguish himself apart from other weavers, to so set him apart from them. This is where less is better comes into play. That is literally saying the exact same thing as stand out, just in a like weirder way, like longer way. Distinguish himself, to be set apart from them. That's so redundant. To remain someone who gets noticed. That's the same thing as standing out. To be fully distinct, that's the same thing as standing out. It is A. So there's lots of questions like this. And that's always what it's like. And then there will be ones like this that take a little bit longer. question 60 asks about the preceding passage as a whole. The writer is considering adding the following sentence, and it's saying, where would you want to add it? And this isn't the full passage, so obviously it would be on a different page, and there's like different letters. So for example, there might be like A, so should he add the sentence there? So that's what it's talking about. So that is example problems for English. All right, math. Oh, I guess I have to I've never used this tool before. I guess I have to erase everything when I'm done. So for math, if you can type it in the calculator, do it quick. You need to do everything quick on the math, especially the ones that you know. If you're like something that you really know, do it as fast as you can, because you need to save time for the longer ones. Don't be like, well, I'll check my work, Mom. That might be what you do on an actual test, but you can't do that on the ACT. You just have to go with what you do right away. And luckily, most of the time, you'll get it right. So checking your work can only happen after you complete all the questions. In the first 30 minutes, try to answer 40 questions. Save the last 30 minutes for the last 20, which are harder. They are definitely harder, especially the last 10. See, 51, 60 are very hard. Just do your best. A lot of times you can cross out some of them, and luckily they're in numerical order. So use the answer choices to test. So we'll look at that in a minute, and you can draw word problems. So here are some example problems. So this one, number 6 right here, says, of the 180 students in a college course, 1/4 of them got an A, 1/3 got a B, and the rest got a C. How many got a C? So this is a word problem, and you need to, if the rest got a C, then it's going to be 1/2 all of the students, which is 1, minus the fractions of the ones that got other things, which is 1/3 minus 1/4. That would tell you the fraction of the students that got a C, but to know the actual amount of students, you have to multiply it by 180, which is the total amount of students. And I don't know what that would be when you get it, but that's what it's like for that one. Now, 15 is one where you just want to put in the calculator because you're like, scientific notation, what would that be? What would that be? You just put that in the calculator. Just do this whole thing times 0.03, which is a percent of 3%, or the decimal for 3%. And the answer for that one I can remember was 1242. All right, this is number 54 is where you use the answer choices. So for a lot of them, well, not for this one, but they're usually, see how 15, they're in numerical order. So if you like plug the answer choice into like something for X, start out with C, and then if it's too low, then go to D or E, and if it's too high, go to A or B. So for this one, it's saying the absolute value of P is greater than absolute value of N, P is positive, N is negative. So for this one, what's best to do is just to assign random values to P and N. So let's say P is 2, it's got to be a positive number, and N is -1, it has to be a negative number, and the absolute value of it has to be less than the positive number. So then you just go through each one like, all right, what gets the greatest value? So you would do 2 minus -1 over 2. So that would be 3/2. And you would just do that for each one. And see, this is 54. So this is obviously it's a little bit harder and it takes longer. So that's what it's like for the math problems. You just have to answer as fast as you can so that you leave time for the harder ones. Right? All right, now let me erase this so we can go to the next section. So, reading. The number one tip for reading is to skim. You have to skim. This is not like your typical English class where you're like, oh, let me see everything that it's talking about, every specific detail. You just can't do that. Like, it's not even an option. Like, if you do this, if you don't skim and you just focus on every detail, you are undoubtedly going to run out of time. What you have to do is pick up on the main idea. Usually just read the like first and last sentences of each paragraph. And by the way, they're about like, 10 paragraphs long or something. They're decently long. So you should underline names. That's what I always do because they're usually asked about. So if you see, I don't know, like John Brown or something, just a random name I thought of. If you see that, just to underline it because it's probably going to say, what did John Brown think about this or whatever? And so then you'll be like, instead of like searching, where is it? Because although if you were able to read the whole thing and comprehend it, you wouldn't have to know where to look. You just can't do that. Like, what I mean is that when you get to the questions, because you have skimmed it, some of them you're going to be like, I didn't remember reading that. That's okay. If you underlined the names, then you can go back to it. So underlined names, places, like whatever the case may be. 60% of the passage details are unused, so don't spend time reading them. It might say just something random, and then it's never asked about you. It was pointless to spend time reading it if you did. Spend no more than 3 minutes reading each passage. So if your test starts at 7:27, well, that's about what time it is right now. But if that's when it's started, then the reading test, then make sure you're done reading the first passage at 7:30. Then move on to the questions. Because remember, you have more questions than how many minutes you have. 40 questions, 35 minutes. Answer quickly on the easier ones. If you see something like, according to the author, these red birds are, and you're like, oh, I remember reading that, answer it right away. Some may be harder. So you need to leave more time for them, just like with the math. Here are examples of what you might see, and I'm not going to answer these because there's not the passage to go with it, but passage B, question 10 shows like how there can be passages where there's passage A and B. So it might say, which of the following assertions about instruments is supported by details provided in both passage A and B. So that's why you need to know the main idea, because that helps you answer that. And 16 actually says that, what's the main idea? And if you didn't figure out what it was, look, it told you, lines 23 to 31, go to that and try to figure out what it's talking about. Usually these questions are actually not that hard. They just seem hard because you have a time limit. I bet if you didn't have a time limit, you could get a lot of these right. But you just have, sometimes your mind just goes blank when you're in a time crunch. So number 20, so in the passage, the phrase something more canned refers to, it tells you exactly where to look at it. Go to that right now, and then read what's around it and figure out what it's talking about. There's a lot like that too. All right, what about the science? For the science, under the passage info or the non-graph table stuff, so that underline any numbers you see. So basically what we're going to see in the next example, let me just go to so you can tell what I'm talking about. So see, it says passage 2, and here's the like paragraph thing, and you're like, oh, I hate that. Well, luckily you don't need to know everything that it talks about in there. Just like, oh, containing 355 milliliters, underline that. 2 experiments were done to study this process. What process? How CO2 gas is produced, generating foam. Oh, sorry, that wasn't supposed to turn on. So that's what you need to know, because then that will help you know what is the point of the experiment is. Okay, back to the other slide. Okay, determine the goal of the experiment. That's just what I just said. Examine the axes and of the graphs and tables. So there's graphs in this case, there's tables in this case, sometimes there's graphs. So it's like, okay, let's see, we have substance, and depending on the substance, there is a different volume and there's a different mass. Okay, and now you can answer the questions. So you don't even need to know everything. Like, you might learn things as you do the question. You're like, oh, that's what it was talking about, and then it'll help you do it in a different one. For every passage, there's about 7 questions. And what I've noticed is that the first 4 are pretty basic and they just require reading the graph. So it will say, so for example, for this one, it might say, for chalk, what was the mass of CO2? 1.36. So there's ones like that, but then there's more complex ones. So like the mint candy and the fruit candy, what was the difference between their volumes? And then how did that affect this or something? Take a lot of steps. So these are actual questions. Okay, well, why that was turning on, because it says apparatus, and this thing was talking about apparatus. Or no, actually, that wasn't even this one. So just forget that thing. That's a fish song. I thought this was the passage that talked about an apparatus. That's what made me think of that song. Okay, if another trial had been performed, this would be one of the easier ones. Oh, and it's just like adding on to it. So they're just saying, oh, let's say instead, there was, for experiment 2, so look down here, instead there was 450 milliliters. You're like, and then what would the temperature have been? Okay, let's see. Well, we can see as the volume goes down, the mass goes down. So let's just, you're allowed to draw on the test. So what I would do is this. I would just be like, okay, I'll write 450. Just pretend like the table extends. What would the temperature have been? And see, the temperature goes up. So, and it probably would have been higher than 60. See? So that's a more simple one. Assume that room temperature is at 25 degrees Celsius, whatever. How many trials for the diet cola was the temperature lower than this room temperature? So, okay, so this one's a little bit harder, but we have 8 trials, see? So you're like, oh, the only temperature's on this one, so I'll just look at this. Well, that's why I have to read this. Everyone was at 3 Celsius. So what was lower than this? All 4 of these were lower than this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, those were all lower than 25 degrees Celsius. I'm not even saying that. And then this was lower than 25 too. So the answer is 5, but others may say 1 on accident because you're like, oh, only that, but all of these were like that. So that's what I'm talking about. Those are more complicated because you have to connect multiple experiments or whatever the case may be. So that is science. Science also, like the reading, is not really that hard, but what makes it hard is the time. Like I said, if you had no time constraint, then you could probably get so many right, but you just can't because time. So you have to do everything as fast as you can. So what about writing? Man, I thought I erased that. Okay. So what you first do is you read and interpret the prompt. So it might be like, okay, well, I already used this example, and we'll see this in a minute. Determine if extracurricular activities are beneficial. And then the perspectives will be like, perspective 1, yes. Perspective 2, no. Perspective 3, no, but for a different reason than the other one. Then you decide your opinion, and they say you can have the same opinion as one of the perspectives, or you can have a different one. You need to have a hook in the first paragraph, which is like, one of the most beneficial things of life is one's exercise outside, or I mean, that's obviously not what you would say. That's just an example of like along the lines of what you would say. And then you would say somehow then connect it to extracurricular activities and then say your thesis. The thesis is what you think. So they are beneficial, and you would say 3 reasons why, and those 3 reasons label A, B, and C. In paragraph 2, you talk about A, so the first reason why, and you give examples. So you say extracurricular activities are important because because they allow exercise. Then say an example like, oh, well, if someone didn't have an curricular activity, they may stay home and play video games instead. Just something like that. And then 3 and 4, you just explain the other reasons. And then paragraph 5, you conclude your essay using examples from other perspectives as a counter argument. While some may say that extracurricular activities are not beneficial, and then you say this, or whatever you think. So this is the thing I was talking about. That's what it will look like. It will be like, for many students, oh, yeah. And then, should students who participate in extracurricular activities be subject to special codes of conduct? So that's not the exact same thing I said, but and then there's 3 perspectives, and then you can just be like, as you read them, like, oh, I agree with that. No, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that one either. And then use this for your to support your argument. All right. Clear. All my drawings. All right. So remember, don't stress. You will meet your goals if you try. If you don't do well, you can retake it. Remember that? I think you can retake it like 12 times. And if you're watching this the night before and you find out that you don't do as well, just follow these guidelines before you take your next test. Or you may be able to do as well as you wanted to do. Just follow my strategies. So I know this was a long video, but I really hope this helped you. This is everything I know about the ACT. And if you have any questions, please post them in the comments and I will try to answer them. So thank you for watching, and that will be it for this video.